And today I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing Professor Naoyuki Agawa. Now, he's a man of many accomplishments. I don't know exactly where to start. He's a leading scholar of American constitutional law and history. Okay? And he has undergraduate and graduate degree from Georgetown University, and he worked in many different sectors. He has worked at Sony Corporation. All of you know Sony. He has worked at Nishimura and Partners in Tokyo, one of the largest, or probably the largest law firm in Japan. But mainly he has been a professor of policy management at Keio University. He was also the dean of the Faculty of Policy Management from 2007 to 2009. Currently, he is emeritus at Keio, and he's a distinguished visiting professor of law at Doshisha University. He has published many books. I count about 20 books, about 15 of them solo authored, 4 or 5 of them co-authored with prominent people. He has won many awards. One that I know well is his book, American History Through the United States Constitution, which received Yomiuri Yoshino Sakuzo Award in 2005. He's somebody who has observed U.S.-Japan relations from both sides of the Pacific, and he's very knowledgeable, experienced, and connected to professional and personal networks, both in Japan and in the United States. And we are privileged to have him here today to share his views on U.S.-Japan relations and what is going on in the changing world that we live in today. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Agawa.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your very kind, maybe too kind an introduction of my past and present. Can you all hear me? Is the microphone working all right? Okay. It's also a pleasure to be here at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, and the state of Michigan. This is actually the first time I'm in Michigan, except for the fact that once upon a time there was an airway called Northwest Airlines, and they used to Detroit was their hub airport, and I went through there once, and so I look out and said, "Oh, this is Michigan," but I have not seen on the ground, so it's doubly wonderful for me to be actually on the ground and to talk to each one of you. And in fact, me and Michigan has a little bit of more story. Once upon a time, I was applying to some American law schools, and some law schools said, "Thank you for applying, but no." Okay, just very briefly. But one of the schools which said, "Please do come and join us," was one of them was University of Michigan Law School. And I had known that the University of Michigan Law School is a wonderful, excellent, one of the best in the country. And I was doubly impressed by the fact that they sent me additional information as to how to be enrolled, and also about housing. No other law school did that. And would you prefer to have a dorm with a fireplace or without a fireplace? That sort of indicated how cold it is here. And I wondered if I should come and study here and get frozen. And it so happened that I was in Washington, D.C. that spring. And it was warm, cherry blossom was out, and I must confess that I chickened out and I went to Georgetown. So I could have come to Michigan much earlier, but lo and behold, I'm here after 30 years or so, and I'm very happy to be here. I also have to mention my sort of me and Michigan thing from the different angle. That is that I have read many times that de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and I was very impressed reading about his entire journey Michigan in 1831 was not a very urban place, to say the least. And he wanted to see the front line of the civilization, so to speak, front line of the United States of America. And he came to Detroit by actually a steamship on the lake, and was very impressed with the fact that people were here already, and some Paris fashion was, here within a matter of a month or so. And he just heard that a bear was walking down the main street of Detroit just about a week before he got here. He then wanted to see more sort of original front line, and he went to Pontiac and Flint, and he spent some time with the local Native American Indian people. And so my memory of Michigan goes back to 1831, and I just wanted to see how things are in places like Flint and Pontiac and Detroit was. Without talking about my personal experiences, let me just move to my subject matter, that is Japan's security policy in East Asia and beyond, North Korea and China and alliance. Or I think this is the original title, Japan-U.S. alliance in the changing world, North Korea, China, and America first. The reason my title says those things is because, A, I think that somehow the world is going through some very big changes. And I have been thinking about what is changing and what is not changing. And I would like to talk about where Japan is in that changing world. And I picked up North Korea, China, and America first, i.e. Mr. Trump, as sort of some changes that Japan faces today. Let me talk about the changing world first, very briefly. I will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and I would like to have more Q&A sessions than my talking, because I've heard this story many times myself. I have heard me speak so many times that I'm very bored with that. And I hope that you don't get bored. If you get bored, there is plenty more sushi, so go ahead and have some more sushi. I will speak for 30 minutes or so. Initially, let me talk about the changing world. I think in a very symbolic way, I have decided to call this changing world phenomenon as the age of walls. It seems that everywhere we are seeing increasing number of walls worldwide. First of all, when Mr. Trump decided to run for the presidential election, one of the first things that he said, and one of the first things that got a lot of attention back in Japan, is the fact that I am going to build a wall along the Mexican border. So that sort of became one of the symbolism of Trump campaign. And I think he's still trying to build walls along the Mexican border. And I thought about this wall thing. The United States of America and Mr. Trump are not the only country and the person talking about the walls and trying to build walls. And there are many examples, but one notable thing is the Brexit. The United Kingdom, which is known to be very democratic and open and trying to be more international, has now decided to get out of the EU. And in a sense, this is building an invisible wall between the continent and the British Isles. And this is a major, major significant move. And in a way, EU is beginning to be a little disintegrated. You also have same phenomenon in some EU countries like Hungary, Czechland, and maybe Austria too, where the anti-immigration sense is so strong that the new government or ultra-right government has taken the power and trying to prevent Middle Eastern immigrants from coming. it's not a physical wall, but they are erecting walls along the borders. And sometimes they physically kick out some of those people who want to come in because of the refugee situation in countries such as Syria. If you go to Jerusalem today, which I did about 3 years ago, and you will see tall walls separating Palestinians from the Jews, or Jews from the Palestinians, and it's very shocking to see that in today's world that man-made walls trying to prevent two peoples from going back and forth. And these are some signs of wall building in today's world. And I think that the people are becoming sort of more, everywhere people are somehow angry and less tolerant and somewhat more selfish. And they're trying to face with and deal with complex problems with some simplified and sometimes too simple a solution, explanation, and then solution. And that seems to be worldwide phenomena. And the question is, how should the United States deal with that? And then how should Japan also handle that kind of situation in this changing world? Let me specifically talk about some of the changes that Japan is going through. It's both internal changes and also external changes. Let me talk first about the internal changes. Having said that, how many of you have been to Japan before, or how many of you are from Japan? Quite a number of people. And can anybody, how many of you dislike Japan and thought that it was a terrible country and you would not want to go back to that country ever anymore, any time in the future? Anybody? No? Really? Well, be honest. I mean, I think Japan has lots of problems. And is there anything that you particularly disliked about Japan? I mean, this is a country of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, freedom of speech. And the reason, yes, please.
I think women are treated unfairly in Japan.
You think so?
Yes.
You're talking to the wrong person. I'm a male. I may be very chauvinistic, and I think that I'm a very, equal opportunity, equal treatment of women and men. But you should talk to my wife, okay? I will give you her number later. You get the truth. There's a lot to talk about that. I don't say yes or no. We have to think about it. That's one aspect of Japan's changes going on. In fact, I'm not sure if women are still being treated very unfairly, but I think they're having a lot of moves in that respect. Anybody else? Any particular point that you don't like about Japan? Think about it. Well, the reason why I'm saying is because I've been surprised that we have lots of foreign tourists coming to Japan these days. I happen to be teaching in Kyoto right now, which is a very famous ancient capital of Japan. And no matter where you go, you bump into tourists, foreign tourists, Chinese, Koreans, Vietnamese, Thais. Typically, if you bump into women wearing kimono, they're not Japanese. They are Chinese, they are Thais, and there are rental places for kimono, and they don some beautiful kimonos and walk around and take pictures, and they seem to like that very much. Americans, Australians, and French, and I often talk to them and try to give them directions, and it's very interesting that you see so many people. The general impression is that those people who come to Kyoto or any other place in Japan usually like Japan, usually have a very positive, somewhat positive impression about Japan. They say that Japan is safe. They say Japan is clean. They say that Japanese people are kind. They say Japan is very affluent. They say that Japan is one of the countries where you can drink tap water without worrying about contamination. They say that Japan is a place where you can eat raw fish, and sushi is quite good, right? That sushi I haven't tried, so I'll try that later. But you know, sushi is very popular, ramen is very good, kind of things. I kind of find it very difficult to believe that everybody in Japan is kind. There are some very mean people there too, but in a way, there seem to be sort of no drastic change in terms of domestic, you know, turmoil, ethnic conflicts, violent movements, terrorism, that kind of thing. So in a way, Japan doesn't seem to have changed very much over the past 50, 60, 70 years. But in fact, I think Japan has some serious issues going forward. Yes, we have a fairly good system, and yes, we have a national medical insurance program, which allows Japanese people to be able to go to see doctors without worrying about huge costs of just visiting doctors and that kind of things. Yes, the Japanese students can get, you know, decent jobs and can earn money. Yes, they can buy houses. Yes, Kyoto, may I say Kyoto is wonderful, right? But the question is whether we can sustain that going forward into the future. The good news is that I'll be gone in about 20 years or so, but you'll be there. And you have to see whether Japan will continue to be able to maintain this relatively safe, relatively clean, relatively quiet, relatively civil, relatively well-educated, relatively welfare-oriented society for a long time to come. There are some problems. One is that Japan is the world's most rapidly aging society in the world. Well, the world's most rapidly aging society. Why so? Because Japanese people nowadays live long. The average age, the lifespan for women now is something like close to 90 years old. And men is, I don't remember, 82, 3, around that time. They don't seem to die, you know. They go on and like you know, one of the energy to battery kind of thing. It just goes on and on and on. And they have plenty of time, and we talk about loneliness of being aged, but sometimes when they feel lonely, they go to the doctors because it's not expensive. Just go to doctor and talk to doctor for hours, and that's becoming a problem because, you know, it's very expensive to use up the doctor's time. Another aspect of this is that the birth rate continues to be low. The government has been trying to encourage young women to have more babies, young couples to have more babies. This has something to do with the equality issue. And one of the reasons why birth rate remains very low is because more and more Japanese women are becoming professional, and they want to pursue their career. And they tend to have babies later than earlier compared to the perhaps 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And they tend to have relatively few children, even if they are married and they have children. Combine the two, we are increasing number of aged people, and we are having a smaller number of young Japanese who will be working hard in about 20 years. And the forecast is that some studies show that by 2050, the Japanese population will be decreased by 25% of this current population. That is 1/4 of the current population will be lost. And plus the fact that close to half of the Japanese population by 2050 will be over age 65. So that means that 1/2 of the population have to support the rest and themselves. And that's a phenomenal number. And currently, Japan accounts for about 12% of the world total GNP. And we boast the fact that although China surpassed us some years ago as the world's #2 economy, the United States being the first, we are now the third, still large kind of things. But by 2050, some studies show that it's going to be only 4% of the world's GNP. That means, very bluntly speaking, and people don't talk very honestly about this thing back in Japan, but we are clearly a declining power. Now, it depends on the definition of what declining power is. If the declining power means that we are going to be declining in terms of safety, cleanliness, and the calmness of the society, civilness of the society, that's a very bad word to describe Japan. But if you think about it, there should be, everybody gets older. And a country like Japan does get older too. And the question is how gracefully to age and how gracefully to be declining. And I think that Japan is now trying to search for ways in which for Japan and Japanese people as a whole to maintain the current status of life standard, and all the good things about Japan, tradition, innovation, and all sorts of things, with the increasing population. It seems to me that there is simply only one reason. That is that we cannot do everything by ourselves. We have to work with others. And so, in a very ironical way, Japan, which has been known as a country tending to be closed door, needs to be open door policy country in order to survive. Many of you have studied the Japanese history. Between 1630 and 1853, at least, Japan was completely closed for 250 years or so. There were only 3 countries in the world which were allowed to trade with Japan. One is China, one is Korea, and the last one is Dutch. The Dutch, because they said to the Japanese samurai government, I'll tell you what, we are not serious Christians, so don't worry about proselytizing you. And we believe that, and the Dutch continued to trade for 250 years. And that was not possible in the middle of the 19th century, and that your Commodore Perry came to Japan and suggested that we open the doors to the world. And he said, by the way, if you don't, I have some guns, the kind of thing. And that was the beginning of Japan's opening. But there is this there has always been this sense that, it was wonderful to be closed, and if we could, we would like to be back in that kind of status. But not now. I think that we have to be open in order to survive and to work with others to survive. Let me be very specific, and here I would like to limit my discussion in security policy. Well, among the changes that are happening in the world, we have our changes in East Asia and beyond. And on top of that list is obviously North Korea. And North Korea to Japan and to the United States is a clear and present danger now. And I'm often asked, is there going to be a war? I don't know. But the situation is that serious that there may be use of force on the peninsula, possibly in the near future. It depends on what North Korea will do, and it depends on what your president will do. It's probably the first time the Japanese people experience a real sense of threat because for the past year or so, maybe more than that, North Korean missiles fly over us. And there is now a new thing called J alert, which tells the local people the area of whose, if the missiles flying toward your neighborhood, there is this J alert siren and announcement that the missiles flying into your direction, please escape or please duck. But when missiles are coming towards you, where do you escape to? I mean, well, I will go run to my grandmother's house. It doesn't make sense. The trains actually stop when J alert is on. And where do you want to go when the train stops and escape where? And you duck, and duck what? If you duck, you can be saved. Nobody knows. It's a very unreal situation, but that is actually happening. You may remember a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, that in Hawaii there was a false alert, and people got panicked. And in a very strange way, that is happening several times, and nothing happens. And the Japanese are becoming a little puzzled as to what is going to happen. But clear and present danger is clearly the case. Now, clearly, I don't know what's going to happen, and we have to be very cautious about what we are going to do. And the United States and Japan are talking about it very seriously, together with South Korean friends of ours and other countries, Russia included and China included. But another real question about the North Korean situation is, this is a very dangerous situation, but what if Mr. Kim goes away? Or what if Mr. Kim is pacified in some way? What is going to happen to the Korean Peninsula? And here is this classical sort of balance of power and international relations issue. Is China going to be aggressive to sort of push the peninsula into their own camp? Is the whole Korean peninsula going to be closer to the United States? Is the post-Kim Korea as a whole going to have nuclear arms, so forth and so on? Historically, the Korean peninsula is very strategically located because it sort of bridges the continent and Japanese archipelago. And ultimately, I think this is part of the China issue. China has to decide what to do about this whole thing. And that's very difficult because I'm not sure if China knows what they want to do, but they have to think, and we have to think, and the United States have to think. Now, China is not a clear and present danger, but as you know, there have been a lot of skirmishes and issues. As far as Japan is concerned, China has been trying to claim and showing their might by infiltrating into the territorial waters of Japan around the island called Senkaku. Now, our Chinese friends, including some here, may say that's Chinese territory. That's a typical Chinese territorial issue. We clearly think that this is Japanese territory, but just about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, the Japanese Maritime Defense Force surveillance plane detected the Chinese submarine coming into that water. And when we found it and published the photo of that, well, when they detected it and it was publicly announced, the Chinese submarine dared to pop up on the surface of the ocean and flew the Chinese flag. And that's how they are saying, and the foreign minister and foreign ministers of two countries talked, but I don't know exactly what they talked about, but it seems to me that it's ours, it's yours, no, it's ours, it's not yours kind of thing. As you know, in South China Sea, they are making sort of building new man-made islands, and they initially say that these are for the protection of fishermen, and don't worry, this is for civilian use. And after a while, there is a military plane spotted there, and runway, and that kind of things. And they seem to be very keen on sort of surrounding, sort of monopolizing that part of the ocean. Let me show you something which may shed some light on that kind of situation in the Far East and Asia and beyond. I don't want to spend too much on this thing, but this is Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Fleet Review 2015. Actually, I'm a Navy freak, and I love this kind of thing. And I was invited to be on one of those ships. And this is an exercise that the Maritime Self-Defense Force does every 3 years. And just to show what kind of maritime force we have, and to show that we are trying to be ready and very well trained in terms of any kind of crisis contingencies in the future. But the most important thing about this is not only to show Japanese Maritime Defense Force vessels, but also to show that we work very closely with other navies in the world. Some navies of a few countries joined this thing, and of all these countries, obviously the United States Navy is the biggest one. The one vessel joined the review period process, but at the same time, it so happened by accident that the USS Ronald Reagan was passing by nearby. I don't think it was intentional. I think it was intentional, but it just so happened that when the Maritime Self-Defense came this way and the Ronald Reagan was over there, it was quite a symbolic showing of the solidarity of two navies. And as I will speak briefly, the Japan-U.S. alliance is very strong and continues to be very robust. But at the same time, I don't have photos for that. Not only the U.S. Navy came to join this thing, but also the Indian Navy's vessels came. The French Navy came. Australian Navy vessels came. And I was very pleased to learn and see that the South Korean Navy vessel, one vessel, came to join this thing. This is to show that in that area of the world that we are working together, because none of these countries can be doing all these security things alone, even including the United States. In these days, in order to maintain peace and security on the seas, we have to work together. And let me show you two maps to think about this whole thing. This is one way of looking at the world maybe from the Chinese point of view. As often said, the Chinese consider themselves to be in the center of the world. And therefore, the name China, or the official name of the People's Republic of China is the Chinese characters indicate, and correct me if I'm wrong, the center flower, Tsinghua. Is that the way to pronounce it? There's one mistake about this map, and that is that Mongolia is included as Chinese territory. And no offense is meant to anybody from Mongolia here. I didn't make this map, but it's very clear that the Chinese consider this world to be China in the center, and other countries, including Japan, Siberia, Russia, Mongolia, Central Asian countries, India, Southeast Asian countries, and Taiwan and the Philippines, all around China. But let me show you one other way of looking at the world. This is it. This is an interesting map because it shows an upside-down view of the world. if you think about it, there's no reason why we have to see the United States of America on top of this Latin America and Europe on the top and Australia down under. They may say Australia is up there, right? This was given to me by a New Zealander friend of mine. Every time New Zealanders go to international conference, and every time somebody shows the map of the world, New Zealand doesn't either exist or it's always on the very periphery of the map, and sometimes it's blurred. So they got so frustrated and made this map, and it shows that New Zealand is on top of the world and in the center of the world. And I like this very much. But this map shows a few other things as well. Number one, number one, as you can see, I think this is it. This is the vast Pacific Ocean. This is the Atlantic this way. And this is the Indian Ocean. We tend to think about three major oceans in the world. But the Atlantic is clearly separate from the Pacific, except for the Panama Isthmus. But the Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean are one and the same. Yes, there are lots of islands in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, and there are some peninsula countries like Malaysia and Vietnam and that kind of things. But people can go back and forth without any problem between Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It sort of dawned on me that this is really one ocean. Number two, if the United States continues to be interested in keeping a presence in this part of the world, the closest country in this region is Japan. In order for the United States to be committed to be trading with China, to be committed to Southeast Asia, inevitably you have to be in Japan. And that's why Commodore Perry came to Japan in 1853. They were interested in doing more trade with China, but they needed a stopping point for him and for American traders to come to China and beyond. And that's very interesting, the significance of Japan's position in this part of the world for the United States. It's in America's interest to have friendly relationship with Japan from the 19th century on in order to be involved in the Eurasian mass and beyond. Number three, if you have a closer look, it so happens that China is here, and India is here, Japan is here, and Australia is here. In a way, China is surrounded by these three great maritime countries. And for China to get out of the continent to go out to the sea, they have to go through South China Sea and East China Sea. I can see why they are so interested in having a sort of a dominant position in this area. I'm not condoning it, but I think that they have, like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, they do need way out, and we are not hostile to that, but Japan and India, Australia together with the United States here, we are sort of keeping an eye on China. And I thought that these maps show some interesting things and sort of provokes your thoughts. Now, given this map, I think what Japan is trying to do in the area of security policy is, I think there are some positive things that Japan is doing, and I think that Japan does have some challenges to surpass in order to continue its security policy, new initiatives and that kind of things. One is that, as I said, Japan needs to maintain a strong and ever improved alliance with the United States in order for Japan to defend its own country and territory, and in order to join the United States in maintaining peace and security and prosperity in this whole region, Japan needs to work with the United States, and the United States is very important in this area. Number two, the alliance has been there ever since 1950s, and it's got about 60 years of history, and it has been mainly a bilateral thing. But now, given the complexity of this area, I think Japan is now trying very hard to work also with other countries. That's why Indian Navy came to join the Naval Fleet Review. That's why the French came. That's why Australian Navy came. There is an increasing sort of cooperation, security cooperation, defense cooperation between Japan and Australia, Japan and India, and Japan also with Singapore here, and where is Singapore? Right here, and also with French in the Pacific, UK, and hopefully with South Korea as well. New Zealand is apparently becoming a little more concerned about the situation, which has for a long time remained a very pacifist country. And also Canada is recently beginning to be committed to this area in security areas as well. Both the United States and Japan are now calling this sort of multiple security network as the Indo-Pacific strategy. Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, has called it free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And that is that in order for the world to continue prosperity and security and stability, this part of the world has to be free and open to everybody, and people, goods, and financing have to go through freely and all over this area, because this is the most fast-growing area of the world. Even Africa is now growing economically. The annual GNP growth is about 4%. They have lots of issues still, but it's even beyond India. Harry Harris, the commander of the Pacific Command of the United States, has called this from Bollywood to Hollywood, and I think that's the sort of idea. And the United States National Security Strategy, which was recently issued last December, I think, also talks about the importance of Indo-Pacific region and the necessity of area countries working together. Now, China is also proposing some new approach to this area, and that's one band, one road idea. And I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. I think that China wants to be part of that effort to be positively and actively involved in the growth of this whole area. But there are some questions to be asked. Are they doing that only for the economic purposes, or are they trying to sort of strengthen their strategic position along the coastal area of the Eurasian continent through the Central Asia, the one band, one road thing? They are called, the Chinese are having a very strategic point, either as their port, military, navy base, or sometimes just, for instance, in Sri Lanka, they had a contract to build a new port facility, and when Sri Lanka sort of went bankrupt, they said, okay, you can't pay, so this is ours for 99 years. It sort of reminds me of the way in which the British Empire stole Hong Kong from the Chinese. So we are cautiously watching. The Prime Minister Abe and some members of the LDP and other parties have indicated that they are willing to join the one band, one road idea, and they will be working together with the Chinese to be positively involved in the development and stability of this area. But we have to be sort of cautious about what the Chinese are trying to do. Now, lastly, I'm spending too much time. I'm sorry, I thought that I would just speak for 30 minutes, but I'm speaking more than that. But there are some challenges to this Japan's response to the security risks in the area, and there are also challenges to what we are going to do in the world. Prime Minister Abe has talked about proactive foreign policy, but there are some Japanese who are not too enthusiastic about it, and they are saying that they are realistic. One is, given the shrinking population, can we man our new security initiatives? Already the self-defense forces are having a difficult time recruiting people because there are fewer and fewer Japanese young people. And even if we have the money to buy new weapons such as F-35, THAAD system, new missile defense system, the cruise missiles, and all sorts of things, can we continue to have a robust and workable, functioning maritime forces if the population is shrinking? That's a very big issue. And one other thing, and last thing, is that despite the fact that personally I think that Japan should increase its roles and missions together with other countries to join the effort to keep this whole region safe and prosperous. There is a very strong pacifist mentality in Japan. And recently, the Prime Minister has proposed to amend the so-called Article 9, which prohibits Japan from having any military forces. There is a strong resistance and a strong feeling that we should not be too strong militarily, and we should not be involved in security policy involving other countries. And we have to see how Japan is going to decide its own way of living and how we are going to meet this new situation, change world, by 2050. I think I'm optimistic that our young friends will manage to continue to keep Japan as a safe, clean, prosperous, and reasonable civil society, but we have to work hard together. Thank you very much.
We have time for, well, about 20 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Yes. Considering China's interest in its so-called sphere of influence there, what has been the foreign policy of Japan with respect to Taiwan? And what do you think the future prospects are for Taiwan in terms of its being able to prosper in this environment?
First of all, it's my policy not to talk about things that I really don't know, pretending that I know something about it, right? So I try to avoid that. But at the same time, I have some personal thoughts on that. And that's only my personal thoughts, but I think I would like to give you my thoughts about Taiwan. Like the United States in the 1970s, we decided to recognize the People's Republic of China as the legitimate Chinese government, and Taiwan, we cut the diplomatic tie with Taiwan. So we don't have any diplomatic relations, official relationship with Taiwan. In other words, we are not recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. However, there is a slight difference between the way in which the United States did that, Carter administration, the way in which Japan did that. Actually, Consul General is the expert on this thing, and then I don't want to make any mistakes about the facts or the way in which to interpret this thing. Correct me if I'm wrong. But for instance, despite the fact that the United States officially cut the diplomatic relationship and decided not to recognize Taiwan anymore as the representative of the legitimate government of China, instead they enacted a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, to continue to sell arms and continue to have a fairly robust cooperation between the United States and Japan, Taiwan. And Taiwanese government was very shocked and didn't want to have no relationship with the United States. Nevertheless, the United States, in terms of security relations, can maintain a very close relationship with Taiwan. And I think that the way in which that they treat Taiwan is much more relaxed than the way in which Japan treats Taiwan. Chinese always complain about the fact that sometimes the American presidents receive the head of Taiwan president of Taiwan from time to time in Washington, but it's complaining and nothing more. Whereas Japan's case, the official relationship between Taiwan and Japan has been very limited, and China is closely watching and complains immediately if we do something close to treating them as official representative. We are clearly saying that Taiwan is not the government of China, but for instance, Lee Teng-hui, who was the president, the first democratically elected president, well, he was the leader of Kuomintang, came to Japan, and they did everything in their power to prevent that from happening, kind of things. Japan has so-called, what's the English word for that? Official, well, private, allegedly private office to be in charge of economic relationship with Taiwan. And my Taiwanese friends always came to me when I was at the embassy in Washington, D.C., that you have to be kinder to us. When we are friends, we like Japan. Unlike Korean friends of ours, we don't complain about the colonization, so forth, so on. And we have to have a closer and more robust relationship. I think, however, that there is a sort of a tacit understanding that Japan and Taiwan work together, not only in economic terms, but we are trying to understand each other, our position and our policy vis-a-vis China. Not that we are working together, but for instance, retired admirals and retired generals from time to time go to China, as well as Taiwan, to see how they are doing. So there is this status quo situation under Madame Tsai, that Madame Tsai's party advocates that Taiwan is an independent country, but she doesn't push too hard on that, and China is frustrated, but that's where it is. At the same time, however, Taiwan doesn't have strong enough forces to prevent any attempt by China to take it over if China decides to do that. As we speak, also, the Taiwanese people are on the continent, and about 300,000 people in China or something, Taiwan people, a lot of Chinese people working on the continent, and the economic relationship between Taiwan and mainland China is very closely tied. And I think that there's no way that Taiwan will be able to take a very strong position against China. The best scenario will be for Taiwan to remain as it is as long as possible, and China tries to do this or that to prevent that from happening, and it's a very touchy issue. The current Abe administration has been a little, slightly more bold in terms of having relationship with Taiwan. I once visited Taiwan and said that Taiwan and Japan, although prohibited from having any formal relationship and any formal security cooperation, that we should be aware of what they are faced with, and we should know what Japan is trying to do. And I called it a sort of a silent alliance, in the sense that we don't have any cooperation going on, but we are. If you take a look at this, Taiwan's position is very important. This is the so-called Daiichi-Retto-sen, the first line of sort of barrier against China's going into the ocean. And this doesn't show, but there are Okinawa Islands all the way to Taiwan. And where's Taiwan? Here. And this is a sort of a natural, not barrier, but lines of dots that are in a position to closely watch what China is doing. And again, we're not talking to each other officially, but we share some interest. I'm a very pro-Taiwan person, and so I may be biased, but that's how I look at the situation. Yes?
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. And I have 2 short comments and 2 questions. And the first is that Michigan law is the best. Go blue.
I regret my decision. So. Are you a law student?
Yes, I am. I'm one at Michigan law.
Great.
Yes. And the second is that I may have painted myself in a false light when I answered your question. I think actually the problem with Japanese society is that men and women need to work together more. It's not that they need to antagonize each other. It's just that they need to collaborate, and women also need to take more responsibility. So I didn't mean to antagonize men. I'm sorry for all that.
No.
if I've caused anything.
I knew you didn't mean it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make it clear. So my first question is, realistically, how should we manage the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands? And the second question is, so when we think about opening Japan up to immigrants, I think that's a great idea. But on the other hand, if we see the United States, Europe, opening up causes a lot of new problems. It could solve our old problems, but it brings in new problems. So how do we learn from the United States or Europe to make Japan a more open and also a reasonably safe country?
2 questions, Senkaku Island issue and the immigration issue. I knew that somebody was going to ask about the immigration policy thing. With respect to Senkaku, again, I don't know really what is happening right now. The indication is that Chinese are finally talking to the Japanese without talking about Senkaku. Recently, the Chinese government, Mr. Xi's government, seems to be more willing to have a more relaxed, less tension-filled talks with Japan. And it sounds like that Mr. Abe may be going to China in the near future. It may be possible for Mr. Xi to come to Japan. My personal observation is that the Senkaku thing has been going on for about 5-6 years. And I think that initially, and even today still, the Chinese have been quite aggressive in claiming that Senkaku or Diaoyu is their territory. They had massive Coast Guards, number of Coast Guards coming into that area. And what is, I think, very admirable about Japan's response was that the Maritime Self-Defense Force, which is essentially a navy, the Navy of Japan, never got involved in that kind of things. And instead, Coast Guard vessels tried to maintain the peace and security and sort of orderly way of asking the Chinese, sometimes fishermen, sometimes Coast Guards, to leave the area. The Coast Guard of Japan is not the most massive force in the world, and they worked day and night. I think that they were very calm, they were very restrained, they never used force. And I think it was, in a way, ironical way, China may have pushed Japan a little too hard. And that series of incidents, series of clashes between the Coast Guard ships and Chinese fishing boats and that kind of things, gave a big alert to the Japanese, and that sort of prompted Japan to do some new things. For instance, in case China takes over the Senkaku Island, for the first time, the ground self-defense force now is assembling a first amphibious operation forces. So they are being trained very hard. About 5,000 people are assembled in one base in Kyushu, and they are being trained by American Marine Corps very, very intensively. The reason why Japan never had amphibious capability was because amphibious capability was considered to be offensive. By definition, Marine Corps' job is to land on somebody's territory and take it over. And that was no under the Japanese Constitution. The government's interpretation of Article 9, which prohibits, according to the government's interpretation, prohibits Japan from doing any offensive military action. But now that there is a possibility, I'm not talking about likelihood, but the possibility that the Chinese may take over Senkaku Island, which we consider clearly view as our territory, it's in our own right to take that island back by landing on the island. And so therefore, amphibious operation is considered to be defensive capability. And in a way, pushing too hard and trying to provoke Japan from doing something about Senkaku Island, the Chinese gave Japanese either excuse or realistic response to have more capability of responding to that kind of situation. So Senkaku continues to be a tension place and flashing point. And we still have submarines coming in, and there were some incidents, scary moments when accidental battle combat could have happened. Once the Chinese, I don't remember whether it was Chinese Navy or Coast Guard, but locked in Japanese vessels, and according to international sort of norms of engagement in a combat, if you're locked in, you're entitled to shoot back. But the Japanese Navy did not. I mean, it's a very, very courageous thing not to, and that avoided accidental combat to happen. So the Chinese may be changing its policy a little bit, and now that Mr. Xi has solidified its power, seemingly, in China, that they may be pursuing a sort of a more sort of peaceful way of talking, and the Senkaku Island issue may be frozen for a while. But we're not sure if that's the end of the story, and we have to continue to be very careful and cautious about what China is going to do next, and that's where we are. Now, with respect to the immigration policy, I have been talking about the need for Japan to work with others, and this shrinking population question prompts one to think about how to deal with that. One is to, obviously, related to your comments first, was to ask women to be more actively in workforce, and as you said, for men and women to work together and learn how to work together. Japanese men are a very clumsy bunch. I mean, they haven't learned how to work with very able, capable Japanese women, so we have to learn how to do that kind of things. America went through, the United States went through the same thing. But that's not enough, and people talk about possible use of AIs in the future to do all the things that we have manually used to do. But eventually, sooner or later, we have to talk about possible sort of increase in allowing and asking foreign people to come and work in Japan. Interestingly, already, Mr. Prime Minister Abe has indicated a few times that we have to relax our immigration policy to allow more people to come in Japan. And I think eventually the issue is to what extent do we want to allow foreign people to be in Japan, living in Japan, working in Japan, and eventually to be naturalized in Japan. Already, the Japanese society is becoming more sort of diversified, nothing compared to the United States. But we have lots of Chinese students working in Japan, Vietnamese students working and studying in Japan, so forth, so on. But we need to think about the way in which to have a system in the long run to treat foreign workers and foreign naturalized Japanese citizens to be treated equally, to be given equal rights. I think, generally speaking, the Japanese people have been kind to foreign workers, and there has been no significant discriminatory practices. But from time to time, we have a sense of that happening maybe here and there. And if the number of foreign workers in Japan increases to a certain degree, and a significant degree, I don't know if the society will be able to cope with that. We have to train, and we have to make Japanese people prepare for that and think deeply about that. And what is happening, as you pointed out clearly and correctly, what is happening in the United States of this no more immigrant kind of thing, and the European attitude to bar immigrants from coming in, is not very good for the Japanese to change its policy. There are plenty of Japanese who want to remain very, very much by ourselves, and they may point out Mr. Trump's statements here and there and say they don't want immigrants to come in. And why do we have to open up a country? So we have to seriously think about what Japan should do, and that needs cooperation. And we have to learn from your experiences of how to create a fair, sort of diversified, multi-ethnic society. So far, you have been very successful, but the world is changing, and there are some risks of going backward. That's my answer to your question. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a constitutional question for you.
I will be happy to answer.
Okay, well, wait till you hear the question. I've been trying to think of the most polite way I can ask this. Do you think we should be more concerned about the future of the Japanese Constitution or the American Constitution? And here's the elaboration. It seems like there might be a lot going on in the United States right now that's just ignoring the Constitution, and yet, which could be troubling. And in Japan, there seems to be a good deal of effort, and has been for a few years, about changing the Constitution. So at least they're paying attention to their Constitution, right? But I'm wondering, do you worry? Do you think we should worry?
That's a very difficult question to answer. First of all, I have to comment on your constitutional situation today. Frankly, I don't know exactly what's happening between FBI and Mr. Trump right now. I try to understand by watching NBC News and that kind of thing, and the explanation is so complicated. I don't know. What I do understand is Mr. Trump is being very bully and sort of aggressive and are you faithful to me kind of things, you know. My reaction to your first question, what's happening in American constitutional issues, is that despite what you see on television and despite all the voices around the country that this is a constitutional crisis, when Mr. President doesn't listen to the FBI, doesn't listen to law enforcement agencies, in fact, I think that the Constitution is working. And that is, I can't guarantee that everything will be okay, but I see that Mr. Trump seems to have thought that once he becomes the President of the United States, he can do anything he wants to do. He has been doing that for a long time as a private company citizen. And if the President Hancho says this, people do that. But in the United States, it's not designed that way as a whole. He thought that he would be able to get money and build Mexican walls. No, he thought that he could repeal the Obamacare just by telling Republicans in the Congress to do that. He has failed to do that. He thought that he would be able to implement a travel ban just overnight, although the Supreme Court has approved some of the temporary measures there. but it took a long time and there was a fear all across the country. What's happening, I think, is that James Madison's idea about separation and power is in a very interesting way functioning. And I think that Mr. Trump should learn, if he hasn't learned yet, that not everything that he wants to do can be done. And Mr. Madison in the Federalist 51 said something very, very smart and something very interesting to me. That is that human nature is such that nobody is perfect, nobody is a saint. And if everybody is a saint, you don't need a politics. And if you want to reform whatever leader that you have, it's just impossible to imagine who is a saint and who is not, and who can be a saint. If so, the safest way to restrain the government power is to give each separate power motivation and constitutional authority to oppose to this. And he famously says that ambition has to be met by ambition. There are plenty of people who have ambitions in the Congress, and they are trying to figure out if opposing to Trump will be something that they should do or should not be the way. Mr. Trump has lots of ideas, and he thinks that he's the smartest guy in the world, but Congress may not agree to that. It's very healthy that Mr. Trump thinks that Congress is a bunch of fools, because Congress thinks, some of them, thinks that we have to stop Mr. President from doing this or that, and people are debating that. And in the result, Madison said that people can remain free, and I think that should continue to be the case. I don't think, unlike some other countries, because of the fact that Mr. Trump was elected as President of the United States, that he will be a dictator, and he will stop, as Hitler did, all the laws and regulations and constitutional rights, and do whatever he wants to do. I don't think that the United States works that way. President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, said something very interesting to me in his first inaugural. He was then trying to still persuade southern states to remain in the Union, and said something to the following effect. He said that those of you who didn't vote for me, I'm sure are very unhappy about me, but don't despair, because the Constitution gave me limited power, and you can get the power back to you every 4 years. If you carefully look what the President of the United States will do and be forever vigilant that no person, even if he is going to do lots of follies and stupid and wicked, will not be able to destroy this republic. And it's interesting that Mr. Lincoln is saying that. Obviously, Mr. Trump is not Abraham Lincoln, but that's I think as a system as a whole, although the Constitution may be abused right now, but I'm fairly optimistic about it. Japanese Constitution, it's difficult to explain what's happening in Japan in short sentences. Japanese, I think, have a slightly different way of looking at the Constitution. Japanese the people have tended to look at the Constitution as a set of goals and ideals, and they considered the Constitution to be a model and list of things that they would like to achieve, rather than actual binding sort of a structure of the government. In fact, Mr. Abe has said so recently, that I want to try my best to amend the Constitution to make the Constitution the sort of agreements among people about our aspiration, what the country should look like. Now, that's fine. I mean, that's one way of looking at the Constitution, But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Constitution functions as a sort of a certain combination of rules about the structure of the government. In fact, I'm not sure if other than Article 9, if people care so much about constitutional provisions. For instance, people talk a lot about Article 9 and whether a certain piece of legislation is in violation of the Constitution or not. There's another article which is prohibiting the government to give public money to charity and private schools. And the Japanese private schools and Japanese charity have totally ignored that. And they don't care whether that's in violation of the Constitution or not, because everybody needs money. And the Constitution doesn't matter. So people want to keep the Constitution in accordance with each one's sort of ideal sort of way of the country. Either wants to amend it a little, but not to amend it a little. And I think that people are quite happy with the current Constitution and seem to tend to think that too much change to that will sort of destabilize the sort of ideal country kind of thing. I do believe that we have to change that Constitution slightly, not in the whole. Edmund Burke said that the country without any system of changing itself can ultimately be in a status of revolution and may destroy the whole thing. And in order to maintain your country, you need to have a system of changing your system from time to time in a peaceful way. And I think that our first change of the Constitution in the future, perhaps in a fairly small way, may be a healthy thing to do. That's my reaction to you. It's very difficult to answer your question, and I need some more hours to really do. I wrote a book last year about constitutional changes and amendments in the United States of America, and I had a chapter about my comments on the way in which Japanese Constitution should be amended or should not be amended. Thank you very much for giving me a sort of a chance to talk about Constitution. I could go on forever. But